Welcome to Think Fast, where if you don't know Natu, you're about to.
Oh my god.
But let's
Bro,
admit
at
it.
least give
It
me
was
a
a
heads
moment.
up. At
It was a
least give
moment.
me a heads up with your like Tiffany's and with your intros. Because my reaction, if you hear all of our past episodes, my reactions to everything is, oh my god. Or in
Very
like
good, very good,
different,
very good.
yes,
But before we get
congratulations.
into RRR, I have to do full call out to Elephant Whisperers, right? Gunit Monga and Sheikh have always done like some fabulous pieces, and this is the first Indian production to win an Oscar. And as much as you might talk about
Insane.
RRR winning the thing, I think you got to talk about Elephant Whisperers and the fact that it won the award that it did, and
Yeah.
it's a moment. Yeah, and she spoke about two women who made this movie, and it's gone to the global stage. It's won an Oscar, and you got to kind of clap for that
Yup.
first,
Hundo.
and then you get to RRR, where like I actually thought the performance was awesome. What they did with the whole Broadway style RRR thing was actually
Yeah.
very very cool.
Yeah, it
I
was
also like
nice.
how
And
they
say, you
do
gloat,
you
you
see
gloat. Aapki
no
bari.
no do you see how they shoved Jimmy Kimmel off stage in his opening
That was
monologue?
hilarious. That was too
Yeah,
good. No, but like, I don't know about you. I mean, I'm sure you were, but I was like very like happily emotional. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Because you had
yeah,
Deepika Padukone making the announcement, and then you had, not like it was awesome that it wasn't your typical idea of a Bollywood movie. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Which was
yeah.
up on the stage. And as someone who was a late RRR convert, what I will 2000% give credit to, and not like my opinion matters because they just won an Oscar. But I love how anyone can watch the film. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's enjoyable whether you get the
yeah. It's a
language,
lot
you
of
don't get the
fun.
language.
Yeah, and I guess that's what's really worked. Right? And even if you like see any interviews, Rajamouli says this. He talks about the fact that he didn't expect this to be as big a deal in, let's say, Western markets, but in the
Yeah.
US, people just went nuts about it. Like it is like because he's got a certain visual flair and over the topness, which I think just kind of came
Works.
across a lot more than, interestingly enough, not Bahubali as much, because Bahubali was also him, and but this, because it wasn't as much mythology and was a lot more real-esque,
Real.
I think that really worked.
Yeah.
But I think in general the Oscars was a lot more entertaining this year. I think the
Yeah.
last time, I mean,
No
apart
one
from
got
there was
slapped.
no one got slapped, but just some of I love the fact that I think all the main winners, the speeches were just so much fun to watch. I
Yeah.
love the reference to moms. I love the reference to the fact that just there's hope and everything else. And so I think it's generally like good vibe Oscars this time. I'm also happy Top Gun Maverick won an Oscar. It had to win some Oscar, but
I,
Tom Cruise
I,
wasn't there.
but I hate saying this, but like Everything Everywhere All at Once was an interesting movie, if your
I haven't
genre
seen it
is
yet.
interesting. Oh, I just could not handle it. Like it was just way too much depth for me.
But going on swiftly to Grammarly. Grammarly has announced a new writing assistant feature called Grammarly Go. Of course, AI submit I'll do, isi mein dal do tomorrow. My khakra wala will also add AI to decide how much farsan you want, um, which makes no sense. The sentence I just said, but it makes sense though for Grammarly to add AI because it largely does that anyway.
Yeah, correcto.
In other news, which is like, why are we not surprised? Meta mulls a Twitter competitor codename P92 that will
Lovely.
be interoperable with Mastodon. Yeah, Meta.
Yes.
First,
Add
sort
more
out the platforms you have. Please add
clutter
more
to the
things.
fuckery. Yes.
Don't P9 on anything. Just make sure that you,
Oh
you,
my
you sort out
God.
what you already have. Uh, are you P9 too?
Jesus, no, I am not. But I'm going to switch gears to another story, which is Apple is reorganizing the management of its international businesses to give more focus on India. Interesting. Which has become an important market for the company. This marks the first time that India will be its own sales region at Apple, highlighting the nation's growth significance. This story is actually super interesting. And I don't know if you saw, but I think Apple's had like some pretty kick ass years, at least for the
Yeah.
past 2, 3 odd years in India, where the iPhone consumer base has grown, erupted, and prospered. What do you make of this, man? And do you think this ties back to them wanting to check out of China for a bit?
and it's also about the fact that Chinese companies aren't doing as well. If you look at like a few years
Correct.
ago, largely some of the biggest phone makers in the country and phone sellers were all like
Xiaomi.
Chinese,
Yeah.
Xiaomi and
Yeah.
Vivo and Oppo and everybody else. You don't hear too much from those companies anymore. So I guess
OnePlus.
that
Yeah.
really helped. And also the manufacturing in India has really helped. I'm guessing their pricing and distributions kind of amped up, because if you remember, like what 3-4 years ago, Apple had minuscule numbers in India, wasn't able to kind of scale up. But I guess
Correct.
two and two, kind of working with the government, figuring manufacture, and secondly the whole China effect, have both helped. By the way, one small side note, I know we spoke about Meta's point earlier. Supposedly, the team wants to use data of all Instagram users regardless of their participation in the new platform.
What? In
Yeah,
P92 for
in
P92.
P9 for P92. So if you have an
But that's
Instagram account,
unsurprising.
it's very
Like they
unsurprising, but
always do this
yeah.
shit, man. In between Facebook and Instagram, like I feel like if you have a Facebook login, you're basically screwed. Like wherever you go, you're being stalked, followed, and you know what I mean? Doused
Yes.
with ads by the
So
lalji folks at Meta.
yes, while Meta does that and Apple reorganizes, what else is going on? For the first time in
For the
decades,
first
people
time.
bought more.
This makes me so happy. This makes me so happy.
But I have a point here. People bought more vinyl than CDs. Who buys CDs anymore? Let's be honest. I think this is an unfair
I
comparison.
I agree with that, but basically looking at both of them as like, old school analogish type, mediums. That one is surpassed the other is, but I feel like vinyls generally. Remember when I called it vinyl? Vinyl has done a very good job of their rebranding.
Yeah.
Like it's it's
I
it's
miss
it's
audio
almost
cassettes
become
though.
like you do.
I was an
Why?
audio cassette. I was a mixtape audio cassette person. I was never a vinyl person. I'm not.
But there's nothing like sexy about a cassette. You know what I mean? Like with vinyls,
It's
it's like this
so
whole
it's
experience.
cassettes
You
are the
take it out of the
best.
cover, you put it into the, oh God, gramophone. My brain is like clogged with
Same
mucus,
thing happens.
and
You
then
take a tape,
you
put in a tape recorder, and you hit that just to see
no,
that
but then
the
that
two things
thing goes
spin.
up, and then it comes on like the vinyl, and then like you know what I mean? It's like a whole situation.
So before this becomes a vinyl versus cassata conversation, we shall move on to the next point, which is professional messaging platform Slack to a point to adopt Chat GPT app technology. अबे यार, okay, everybody has Chat GPT, सब use करेंगे. ये अभी न्यूज़ में डालना बंद करो. Everything is Chat GPT. We are all Chat GPTs. Are you still laughing about Chat GPTs?
Oh my God. Varun is so exasperated. He's just like, Bhaad mein jao.
But
Don't show me
everything is
one more headline.
ChatGPT. It's like saying everything is built on the internet. Yes, we know that's what we all operate on.
Yes,
But
that's
no,
true. Give us your
no. I'm
fodder.
just generally saying that
It's become a
it
feature.
it's become a feature. It's become something
Yeah,
you add into the way every single technology is built. And at some
correcto.
point, while everyone's doing it, I don't think it's news anymore. It's just something that everyone I feel has to do. The
Exists.
only worry is if everybody builds it onto this platform and it is AI and it's learning. We've all seen Terminator. Think about that.
Yeah, AI is dumb. But in any case, we can talk about that on another episode.
That's what
Let's
happened
nuke
on
out the
Judgment
last
Day.
two. Of
Okay.
course.
The Ayurveda Co raises USD 12.2 million in Series A round led by Six Sense Ventures. Any thoughts? One second. We should read these
Oh
notes
my
before we
God,
record.
so
We didn't
spaced
read
out.
anything.
No, but this is pretty interesting, man. I think the Ayurveda Co has really been like, at it, adding bricks and bricks, one step at a time. Actually, the thing that's interesting is that beauty is still relevant. I feel like a lot of other categories, whether you look at fashion or even FMCG products for that matter, outside of BPC as a category, everyone's kind of like come and gone. You know what I mean? Like everyone's like been like a flash in the pan and then magically disappeared. Beauty seems to be that one category that still has fairly decent sized businesses coming out of it, and it is not giving up. Like with fashion, like fashion had a moment when like Mintra was peaking, not that Mintra stopped peaking. And then, the general excitement and brouhaha around fashion cool down. It doesn't seem to have happened in the case of beauty, man. I don't know what
I
your
think
take on
I
this
think
is.
D2C and personal care, etc. I think this category will always continue to grow because it's still very under-indexed. There's still so much opportunity there. It's just that people have stopped calling themselves D2C only. They're saying that term has kind of gone away, which I think helps because you
Yeah,
have to be across both shelves. And
yeah.
as long as you're kind of building it like a product business and not trying to
Hmm.
use terms to kind of get funding in, I think you are raising, and I think that's what happened in this case.
Yeah.
And I think it'll continue to happen in most of these categories. We still have the opportunity to create so many more brands across sectors, and and it also shows that people are getting funded, and also people at early seed stage and even like Series A are still being able to raise in the market. It's very openly. It's a fact that across the investor circles you see this. It's only people who are trying to get investments at growth stage,
Yeah.
Series B onwards, who are kind of struggling to get the volumes which they might want. So whoever has cash reserves is sitting fine, but it's the others who kind of struggling a little bit. But
But
as long
$12.2
as
million dollars is a really large Series A. This is
yeah,
not like a normal size Series A.
it's not.
This is like, I mean, this is like Series B for a lot of companies, man.
Yeah.
But irrespective of what series it stacks in, I hear you, which is, easier to sort of raise around momentum than, if you're already clocking that 100 crore plus GMV benchmark, and then you're trying to figure out, where next you're supposed to scale to.
Yeah. And so before we go into our break, we will run through a quick set of what we're doing today. Today's a slightly different episode. We obviously, everybody's been talking about the Silicon Valley Bank and what's been happening there. And so we thought, since you and I are not banking experts, that she will bring in, what do you call, you're calling him a black swan expert? Is that what you're calling him?
A Black Swan corresponder, Mr. Vidur Singhal.
Yes, he's coming in to kind of give us some insights. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about is going to turn technical. So in case some of it feels too technically, you might want to kind of Google a few of those terms. We'll try to give you a broader landscape of things. So that's coming up later in the show. We're also talking about this interesting article in the Ken about Hotstar and Disney Plus, and why for Disney Plus to grow, Hotstar has to die, which is it's got a hardcore term, but it's interesting when you actually look at the numbers deep down. And also talk about this very weird new version of Spotify that they're launching, which is like a TikTokification piece, and which looks getting major backlash from people before it even launches. And also a very weird stream on event. So you're going to get into that, but all of that after this break, while I still celebrate RRR.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. Listeners, presenting to you Club Saris Says, the premium tier offerings of our podcast. Club members will get exclusive Cock and Bull episodes every Monday, extended and unfiltered versions of the guest episodes, access to the Club Saris Says Discord server, and audio offerings such as ad-free episodes and early access to guest episodes. Also, members get to decide the topics of the live episodes and get their name on the producer's slate at the end credits. On Cock and Bull, it's a cricket special episode featuring Akash and Sriram. They answer some AMAs from their listeners. On the Vox podcast, Monica talks to Tina Sidana, Business Development Head of Alexa Voice Services at Amazon. They discuss the key aspects of voice and audio marketing, content marketing, and advertising. On All Things Policy, Leah and Harshit discuss the importance and requirement of sex education in schools. And on Vartalab, Akash and Naveen have a fun chat with me, Abbas Momin, stand-up comedian and podcaster. They spoke about how Abbas, that's me, went from studying dentistry to writing and performing comedy and podcasts, and his love for movies. Once again, don't forget to visit our merch store on ivmpodcast.com. We have some exciting stuff for you over there. Follow us on social media via IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you like our shows, spread the word, tell your friends, and don't forget to rate and review them wherever you're listening to them. You'll also find all our shows on youtube.com/IVM Podcast. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: LIC of India, Yono SBI, Cash Free Payments, and HDFC Mutual Fund. Thank you for making this possible.
Welcome back to Think Fast, where if you are asking the question, where do I watch Succession because HBO is going off Hotstar, that's how the Ken started an article about the whole Hotstar Disney Plus thing that's been going on. Just for context, they lost the digital rights to the IPL, so one big chunk of subscribers went away with that. Jio took them off the bundle. They lost a huge ton of subscribers there as well. Now they've ended their deal with HBO, which they've had since I think 2015, where all HBO shows would be on Hotstar, and people are turning around saying, once again, what am I subscribing to Hotstar for? Right. And it seems to be a bizarre set of moves for them. And there's this interesting article by Praveen Gopal Krishnan on the Ken, and he says that actually these are all strategic moves because for Disney Plus to expand, the Hotstarness needs to kind of go away, and it's in a very interesting breakdown. We'll leave the thread in the show notes, but the larger context here is the fact that Hotstar, obviously, as they became part of the whole Disney Plus piece, had multiple parts which were reasons why people subscribed. The bottom layer was people who were just coming in for, let's say, regional cinema, movies,
Yeah.
and TV shows, etc. The middle rung were people coming for the IPL, and the premium rung were coming for HBO, etc. The interesting part is when you look at the actual numbers of Disney, guess the average revenue per subscriber that Hotstar makes. They make 74 cents per, and this includes ad revenue.
Yeah.
So compare that to a Disney Plus, which is $5.7 without ad revenue. That's the difference. So you might have a massive number of people, but the amount of money you're making is so little that at some point the IPL piece wasn't making economic sense because you're just building to scale, but you're not making any money off this. And it also makes the IPL the center of Hotstar. In the same way, the HBO shows become the center of Hotstar. I think if you look at what Bob Iger's kind of said post coming on board, he wants to focus a lot more to go deeper into Disney Plus franchises, Disney Plus content. And if you see the app now, the Disney Plus, the Hotstar app has also kind of changed to look exactly like the Disney Plus app globally. It's no longer looking Hotstar like, it's looking exactly Disney Plus like. So this seems to be almost a move to say, one second, there's no point in having thousands and millions of subscribers if you aren't making that much money from them. You'd rather get a core set of people who will continue to subscribe and go deeper. And that seems to be the case. But it's interesting to understand that we've always talked subscribers for all these platforms, but we've never talked about revenue per subscriber, which is what the most interesting part of this whole article, which according to me was.
Yeah, I kind of want to know why the Unsef, who writes for the Morning Context, retweeted this saying there are takes and then there are jokes. So I think, there's more that meets the eye there, or maybe it's just the Morning Context, the Kenka, whatever, Saas Bahu fighting that they keep having. So just a couple of things, right, without having read the article. So, pardon me there. But none of this is like revelatory. In India, the only businesses that have subscription businesses have like subscription only has never been a model. If you look at even Netflix in India, for that matter, everything is and maybe not yet, but over a period of time, everything is becoming a sum of parts. And if you look at it, like, there's one marketing book I genuinely really like. It's called How Brands Grow by Brian Sharp. And he literally, I mean, he articulates as much better than I will, but every single company in the world has a very long, mid to long tail of consumers who are transient consumers of the platform. It's like the same example that that we discussed when we were talking about the Bloom and like Sajid Pai's report, right, where power users, your top 5% Zomato orderers drive like close to whatever the number was, 50-60% of their overall revenue. The point that I'm getting to over here is these power laws of subscribers and actual contributing users versus overall consumers and users has existed pretty much across any consumer tech platform. And Hotstar also, for that matter, had a pretty, I know obviously during IPL and all, things have gone to shit, but they had a very robust and a strong sales team. And they used to do decent revenues. Obviously maybe not enough to recoup the cost of first off like buying that content and distributing, marketing that content, so on and so forth. But they made like a non-trivial amount of money through their advertising base. So the point that I'm getting to is every business model is a sum of parts. I didn't quite understand what about this article in the Ken was particularly revelatory compared to things that we already know. Do you know what I mean?
It's interesting because you always looked at the subscriber base as a bundle, right? You look at the fact that, okay, can a OTT platform survive with a specific kind of content? Like, look at a Lionsgate play that kind of came in some time back. You have an HBO Max, which now says that they might launch their standalone app. And one of the points he makes, which I found very interesting, it's an interesting insight to kind of think about, which is the fact that people don't subscribe for one particular kind of content. They want a mix of things. And the
Yeah.
assumption always was Hotstar amongst all platforms. Because when
Had the
Netflix
best
first
mix.
came in, yeah, they had Hotstar had the best mix. They had the IPL, they had international shows with HBO,
Yeah.
etc., and they kind of had the regional stuff and Hindi cinema. Now, if you look at any other platform, Netflix took some time to get its mix right. They have been evolving in the right direction. Amazon Prime actually, interestingly, has always had their mix very spot on. They even got into
Yeah.
sports recently, so they're very interesting to look at. Hotstar, on the other end, I feel this mix piece works till it's a certain scale, and what you kind of what you focus on, I feel, is important. And the more I dug into this, and I'm not going on entirely by what he's saying, but I think some of these things are interesting to think about, is that as much as you believe a bundle works, you got to think of the mix of the bundle and what you're prioritizing for the long term. And I feel that's almost a learning here. When you look at the content piece, you're looking at, okay, what is the mix here, how are you making money, but also like what are the sum of your parts, and are you leveraging the thing that you own the most, which is, I think, the
Yeah.
Iger model is interesting, because he's saying let's leverage what we own entirely, which is all the Disney franchises, versus leveraging what we don't own, which is HBO or the
IPL,
IPL.
IPL. Yeah.
And I feel that makes it's more long term. Plus, it's also, let's be honest, it also makes sure that he can like tighten up costs a lot more and lean this operation
It's
out.
Netflix's model.
Yeah.
It's literally Netflix's model, right? Like, go all in on original, go all in on content that will have a longer shelf life, that can be built more cheaply, that's almost proprietary to your platform. But I feel like every company gets to hear at some point, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
the natural trajectory of every, like, it's not like Netflix started with original programming, right? Netflix also started as an aggregator. And not to compare, but if you like even look at retailers for that matter, retailers always start as aggregators, but then over a period of time everyone becomes a private label peddler. Right? So and you become a private label peddler because that's how you keep your gross margins afloat. So the strategy is totally sound. I don't know if this is something that Hotstar would have, Disney plus Hotstar would have, eventually got to themselves. You know what I mean? Like over a period of time, versus it kind of being like yanked the way it is right
And I
now.
think what we should also look at is saying who's going to become the biggest player of the all, because Hotstar was far ahead of everybody else.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
had
yeah.
everybody else playing catch
Don't
up.
you remember last year? Everyone was just like, "Oh my god, Netflix strategy sucks. Netflix has totally screwed up India." We guys also discussed it on Think Fast with
Yeah,
Chomus.
yeah, and they seem to have gotten their act together. Some of the shows they're
Yeah.
doing, etc. But there's also the biggest player in the room, kind of coming in, which is Geo coming in saying
Geo.
IPL is free for everyone to watch. And
Yeah.
if I've read right, they might be they've acquired so many movies that they're going to have more movies dropping every week than anybody else, and Indian movies dropping every week than anybody else.
Holy shit! Wow.
So it's going to be like crazy. So they're basically going to have the IPL for free and like a ton of movies kind of coming out, because they've bought a ton of rights. So it's going to be interesting to see how the entire landscape is skewed. Because I mean, no, just think about like 4-5 years ago, right? Netflix was obviously just a new entrant, so tinier player. Amazon Prime also was trying to figure out. I think first couple of shows had done well. You had names like Star and Z, etc. were really like up top. Everything's flipped around in a very interesting way. So I feel that's what's interesting, and I'm also looking at saying who can kind of look at their bundles differently, because we are technically back to television, because Lionsgate Play
Yeah.
now shows up in your Apple subscription or as part of Amazon Prime. Everyone's bundling into each other. So you're technically just buying a bunch of channels which have a lot of shows, and that's you're back to television.
We're back to where we started. We're back to where we started.
Exactly. So that's the reason I want to discuss the story, because I think the landscape kind of changes, and I thought some of the points he made were interesting to understand. Just the fact that you might have something for everyone, but what you leverage to get that something for everyone might be something to look into. Was my broader insight on this one. What else do we have to talk about? What else do we talk about? Oh yes, we're going to talk about the TikTokification
Oh my god!
of
Did you
Spotify.
watch this, by the way? I totally did not catch this like live.
I watched bits and pieces. I mean, basically, they put up bits and pieces on their Instagram. I also went on the Vergecast, which, if anybody's interested in tech news, great podcast to listen to, and now also watch, because they start putting the episodes on YouTube. They were fully dissing on the design and what they plan to do, because it I don't think it makes sense what they're trying to do. And it goes against the base tenant of what Spotify is, right? I mean, just for anybody who hasn't seen it, Spotify is going to change the app in a way that you have almost like a stream of content. You swipe from one to the other on the app. Whenever you have one podcast clip going into one more podcast clip, or like a song going into another song, but it's very visual. It's very like full screen in that sense of the word. Unlike right now, when you kind of go, you get an assortment of playlists, etc. there, and there's been a large amount of like people saying, "What the fuck," right? But I feel what's interesting is why they seem to be doing it, and I feel that's the insight from the Vergecast that was
Gen
there.
Z.
Just like two things. I think two factors are interesting for Spotify. One is Spotify is supposed to be the world's foremost music platform, but all the hits come off of TikTok. If today a music label wants their song to become a hit, that song has to do well on TikTok. It doesn't matter if it does that well on Spotify. People go from here. Like TikTok has literally made people launch shorter songs so they can become one TikTok.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's one global trend. So suddenly TikTok's taken over that part of it. Secondly, a lot of the podcast bet hasn't really paid off the way they thought it would. And they need to focus on ad revenue and creators, etc. They use the word creator the most across this entire stream on. They kept saying creator. They literally got, I think the Jonas Brothers came in and introduced one of the creators just to kind of introduce, got them in to introduce a creator. But if you look at it on ads on Spotify, either you're listening to the ad, or largely one of the things they actually sell advertisers is visual ads. But when you're playing Spotify, your phone's in your pocket or it's lying on the table. So you're not necessarily looking at that ad. So what makes you look at your screen is that you have something happening on that screen, which is why I'm guessing they've gone in this direction. But it fundamentally changes how people listen to things. And I feel that's the part which I don't really get. I'm like, I understand the reason why they're doing it, but it fundamentally doesn't align with how anybody listens to content.
Interesting. On Spotify specific, but maybe there is some insight there, right? Like I know that they've had a major thrust on videos within podcasts itself. And I'm not a Spotify user, as you already know. But for example, like, can you watch music videos on Spotify? This is going to sound like a really dumb question.
They do play certain parts of it on loop when the song is playing. That's anyway been showing for a while, where that kind of plays on small. It's almost like an extended GIF that plays. You don't have music videos. Apple Music actually has music videos as a separate section altogether. But Spotify hasn't had it. But video podcasts are now on Spotify. They have been for a while. So those have been there.
So I assume maybe there's some like early data on a customer who uses Spotify for video consumption ends up being a more retained consumer. I don't know what it is. Like, these companies are fairly robust when it comes to using data to make decisions. But I have two other comments over here. One is, what is the future of Spotify? Because they haven't been able to crack anything super well, right? And let's be honest, music is a low margin game.
Terrible business.
Yeah. And especially in their kind of construct, right? Where whatever. So music, obviously there's no monetary, there is a viewership future there. There is no like monetary predictable future over there at all. Their other bet was podcasts. And again, within podcasts, they acquired a bunch of podcasting companies like Gimlet and all. But now they've totally pivoted out of that, which is cool. Every, big company goes through their own changes, and now they've gone into the platforming type approach. What do you think their monetization is going to be? And do you think this, obviously you mentioned one part of it could be ads, but how do you think this is going to contribute to their growth?
I feel that they'll become a more and more video going ahead. They will have an audio component for music and even podcasts, but I feel they'll become more and more video. They have to, because the only way they can build it off an advertising business is to have some form of visual pieces there. Because in audio, there's only so much you can do, right? You can just have ad inserts there, and because people aren't necessarily paying for those subscription bundles. And I mean, I see more subscription bundles for every podcast player show up on Apple Podcasts. But I haven't seen that on Spotify. There's a lot of those. Everybody has a bundle. I don't know how many people are paying for it, but everybody from Indian to international to international podcast companies all have a bundle you can pay for getting early episodes, for getting ad-free episodes, and
Yeah.
even access to archives. And that's, I mean, I started to use Apple Podcasts a little bit more of late because some of the shows I listen to, the episodes don't drop till like say a week or after they show up on Apple Podcasts. So I might as well just go to
Yeah.
Apple and get the episode is what I was thinking of. So I feel they'll have to go visual. They'll have to figure a way to make more
But
money
just
off
sorry to
audio.
interrupt you, but don't you think TikTok is a killer then? Because that's literally what TikTok is. TikTok is a visual Spotify.
TikTok is a visual Spotify, so they'll have to become a weird mashup of TikTok and YouTube, which is a bad idea if you ask me.
Yeah.
And they're kind of stuck in the middle of no man's land, right? In that sense, or no woman's land, whichever one you want to choose.
Yeah.
But I just feel it's a tough spot because they are the place everyone goes to for music. That's where everybody gets their playlist from. How do you get more people to pay for a Spotify premium account? Could be one of the ways to do it. But
Yeah.
I mean, they launched their AI again. One more. They launched their AI Smart Shuffle feature and a few other pieces, but they're in a tough spot.
Yeah.
I don't know how you reinvent audio. I mean, if you look at Apple's in the smart thing, but just Apple Music is what it is. They have the radio, they have songs.
Also, it's a
but-
feature, it's not a product. Like it's
Exactly.
like
Apple can-
one ginormous part of the overall suite.
Exactly. Apple can afford to do that. Apple can afford to pay for the kind of talent they get on. They get a lot of the exclusives. They do all that stuff. Because for Apple, it's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
Does this mean Spotify gets acquired? Is my question.
Dude, they're like, it's like, I wonder what their moat is going to be, because unlike Netflix, which again, one could argue is sort
Which
of
is going
stuck
to
in the
be my
middle of
point.
nowhere.
Which is my
Yeah.
question.
No, but
Would they
Netflix
make the
and
best
moat is still-
partners?
Ooh, Netflix, Spotify ka Milan. I'm here for that. I am here for that. Both have great branding.
Yeah, Netflix, Spotify, gaming, music, movie shows. I mean, there's something there. Or does just like Disney buy everything off? Never know.
Perhaps.
Disney,
Never know.
Perhaps you never know. But please, whatever you do, Spotify, do not stop promoting my podcast because you love
Oh
me,
my
don't you?
god. Nice plug-in. Saved your own ass, son. Saved
Save
your
my own
own
ass.
ass.
But okay, now it's time to go on from this to going to deep finance banking stuff, and tap into the SVB, the MVP on the SCB to the whatever that else thing is, but
FTX.
SBI, everything. Sab bolo. RRR.
RRR.
Because Suchita has no idea what SVB stands for, and neither do I. I just thought it's a new ice cream flavor. We have someone who actually knows a little bit more about what's happened with the Silicon Valley Bank. I know that, but you don't. Suchita, I'm talking to you.
Of course, I don't.
We've got a special guest in here who Suchita snuck in to say, suckered in rather, to say that come in, talk about this because you get nothing for coming on this show. And I get to meet him and be nice to him because I am the nice one on this show.
Of course. Take all the credit. Why don't
Why
you?
don't you introduce?
Ladies and gents, our guest speaker / co-host from our last episode, Mr. Vidur Singhal, is back. Vidur is my smartest friend, and that's going to be my introduction about him. He's like a banker, poker player, overall, little boy genius, Chota Bheem. He's not really Chota, but yeah, you guys get the gist. And he's going to give us a TLDR on all things SVV and what perspired / went down over the weekend. So why don't we kick off with that, man, Vidur? For those of us who haven't been glued onto Twitter and been creating threads about 10 things you can learn from the SVB debacle, how would you summarize what transpired over the weekend?
Well, firstly, Such, I follow you on Twitter, and I saw that you dunked on someone who created the thread. So
I
to
did
the
not
extent I
dunk
thought
on
about
him.
creating a thread, I
Oh
completely
my
stayed away from
God.
it. But let me just say, listen, like, what a weekend, right? Like, what a weekend, because, that expression, like, sometimes nothing happens for decades, then decades happen in weeks. This was one of those weeks, and I think we've been having a lot of those weeks in this decade in particular. But to sum it all up, when VCs talked about it, they called it an existential risk to the VC ecosystem because Silicon Valley Bank went under, and it was essentially the bank of Silicon Valley. That sounds like a very obvious thing, but it actually served 50% of all venture-backed startups. And let's talk about why that's extra important, because there's a lot of startups that traditional banks don't like to touch. Just the way like people don't like entrepreneurs in India. Over there, you can't get a loan, you can't get a bank account sometimes, and enter SVB, right? Like when everybody else is asking for your Aadhaar card and your voter ID and this and that. These guys are like, okay, you have a business card, let's go, let's start banking. And as a result, they had just become crucial to the ecosystem. The timeline of events, I'm going to keep it very high level here, very forest for the trees. It's more important to understand the broader context. And of course, we're right in the middle of it still. This is, of course, Monday that we're recording. Over the weekend was the crux of the crisis, and Sunday night, US time, the Fed announced that they're essentially rescuing it, which is something we'll get into as well. So very forest for the trees. What happened, is around Thursday and Friday, the stock price of SVB went down to such an extent because of some activities on their balance sheet that VCs raised the alarm. They're like, hey, this bank that we love, we follow the stock price, it's down 40%, 50%, 60%. They start messaging their group chat saying, guys, this is maybe risky, let's take our money out. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it becomes sort of a traditional bank run. We can get into what that means as well. Essentially, too many people try to take out their deposits. Banks are not built to be able to handle that. By Friday, the bank is shut, and the whole VC ecosystem of the United States and India, to some extent, which we'll talk about as well, is wondering what is going to happen to all the funds they had in there, to the tune of $150 billion. It was the 15th largest bank in the United States even before the withdrawals happened.
Holy shit. But major narrative violation literally this morning, right?
Well,
I mean,
a narrative
everyone thought
violation,
sab
I
mar
think-
gaye, lut gaye, but Miss Yellen.
The narrative tends to be sensationalism and catastrophe. So in that sense, a narrative violation. I think what you're referring to is the fact that, of course, the Fed rescued the bank. A lot of people are calling it a bailout. We can get into why that might not be the right term. It might be colloquially correct to say that the Fed, which is the central bank, bailed them out. But bailout has a negative connotation, because in 2008, with the global financial crisis, a lot of banks were bailed out, seemingly at the cost of the taxpayers. As it happens, by the way, over the course of 10 years, the taxpayers ended up making money on those bailouts, which is another narrative that gets brought up. But anyway, the Fed essentially didn't bail them out because the holders of the equity of SVB, it was a public company, almost $15 billion plus, down to zero, bankrupt, right? And the holders of the bonds, which is even worse, if you're a bankrupt company, down to zero. But what the Fed has done, which was very, very crucial, is that they have promised that the depositors will be made whole. And this is a very important thing to get into. Forget the bailout, forget the politics of it. These depositors were not just VCs and Silicon Valley startups. I mean, a lot of them were. There were a lot of business accounts. The bank was very unique. We can get into why this happened in a moment. But these were real people, like real money. And to give a context of the scale and the size, this is 10 FTXs put together of not crypto gamble funds. This is real businesses, real money. In the US, by the way, payroll happens on the 15th. So they had a couple of days to make payroll, and they were looking at empty bank accounts. So if the Fed hadn't stepped in and said, all your deposits will be accessible, as opposed to the 250,000 that is guaranteed by the FDIC, which is sort of an insurance scheme. We have this in India as well, by the way, up to 5 lakhs. 250,000 is not too much for a business, as both of you know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What would have happened on Monday? Every business looking at what happened to SVB across the United States would have called their banker and said, bro, $249,999 balance hona chahiye. Everything else should be in government bonds, and that's it. I don't want to deal with this like counterparty risk with my bank. So the Fed had to come in and inject a lot of confidence in the system. And I have to say, like, this is a weird thing for like Bitcoin and crypto people to wrestle with, because actually it just shows how faith-based our money system is. It's just the nature of it. Fractional reserve banking is what we use, where banks don't need to have one-to-one deposits. They take your deposits, they give most of it as loans, they keep about 10%. If more than 10 or 20% of people come and demand their deposits back, you're going to have a run on the bank. And on Thursday, $42 billion was asked for withdrawals out of SVB, their total being $180 billion. No bank could have taken it. So anyway, the Fed came in and sort of saved the narrative, as you said. But the question is this enough? Just to add some historical context, and do stop me if I'm ranting a bit, but in 2008, everybody remembers the Lehman moment, but people forget the Bear Stearns moment, which was March of 2008. Lehman was September of 2008. Bear Stearns went under. The Fed forced JP Morgan to buy it at a very low price. It's not exactly a bailout, but something similar. And then everybody was like, "Oh, I guess we're saved. I guess we avoided disaster." 6 months later, the global financial crisis happened. So we got to be cautious. We got to really think about the root cause here, and then really think
Yeah.
about the second order impacts as well.
I just want to pick up one thing. Like I was looking at the balance sheet of the bank, and just to understand where this kind of happened. And the whole point is that they went too heavy on bonds. Is what I got from it. Is the fact they went too heavy on bonds, and then when there was, I think the interest rates were hiked, and that's what led to them coming to this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very actually good basic summary of what happened. Now, I have to say that is the role of a bank. As I just said,
Yeah.
they take deposits, so that's the liability side of the balance sheet, and they go invest them in assets, and they make money on the spread. What they call the net interest margin. Now, SVB was unique because they had such a high exposure to startups that they were double dipping on the zero interest rate environment. You know what I mean? During zero interest
Okay.
environment, startup funding went through the roof, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
like there was crazy money everywhere. So the deposits went up about 4x over the course of 2 to 3 years. No bank can handle that growth. Now,
Yeah.
they have to do something with this money, right? How else will they make a margin? So they went and put a lot of it into, most banks will give out a lot of loans. Let's say 50% of their like asset size will be loans. These guys were a little light on the loans because they grew so fast. They invested a lot of it in securities. Now, these are safe securities, but at the low interest rate environment, they were yielding, give or take, 1.5%. 2 years later, the Fed, which has, by the way, essentially had two extreme cycles within 2 years. Usually, each cycle should be like 4 or 5 years. Rates go up, rates go down. Because of
Yeah.
COVID and the shock to the system, the cycle has been so extreme. Rates went up to 5% instead of the expected 1.5%. So those bonds that you're holding that are paying 1.5%, just by doing bond math, when the rates go up, they're worth 20% less. So these guys were sitting on essentially a 20% unrealized gain on their books, unrealized loss, excuse me. And the way bank accounting works, I used to cover banks as an investor. It's very funky. It's like the whole system has just been engineered to make it work. And so you get to decide when you take a loss. You get to decide when you mark to market. There's a lot of regulation that like keeps everything at bay. So essentially, these assets that were not worth as much as they were in the past had not been marked to what their current value was. So the timeline actually was that actually when they started facing withdrawals, they had to sell some of these. They had to absorb the loss. Those unrealized losses became realized. And then they went to the market and said, "Hey guys, like we've actually lost 2 billion because of these like losses that we had to realize. So we want to raise more capital. We want to raise 2 billion." And then finally they shone the light of themselves where people were like, okay, let's look at these books, why they're raising 2 billion. And they realized
Yeah.
these guys were sitting on a whole bunch of assets that weren't worth as much as they were on the actual books. So now to the broader point, the Fed has done this and every bank holds these securities. Right? These guys had about $20 billion in unrealized losses, which was more than the book value, the equity value. Hence, they went under. Right? You're bankrupt. You have liabilities more than your assets. You're bankrupt. Wall Street Journal did a quick calculation of unrealized losses amongst all the banking system, 680 billion, give or take. Now, how do you manage that? That's what the Fed is trying to do. And we can get into how the Fed is doing it in a moment. It's a little bit granular, but this is an existential risk sitting there. It's just that most big banks are not as exposed to these securities as SVB were and are better risk managers. Like, let's not take away the blame from SVB. Like, of course, your job as a bank is to manage your risk, which they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Varun has a
if you go-
question.
if you go broader on this, right? There's the technicality of it that you've spoken about. How does this affect two things? And how does this affect, let's say, how VCs function going ahead? And more importantly, how does this affect, like, let's say, global startup ecosystems, let's say India, other markets as well? Does this spread that far, apart from maybe a Y Combinator, which I know has some legs which have come this far, but does it really affect the other markets as much?
It's interesting. Can we talk about the Y Combinator thing for a moment, just to contextualize how real the situation was in India? Because listen, you and I and the three of us, as in, were not affected, right? Like, we were impartial observers. But, that made it a lot easier, essentially, to follow the news and be unbiased. But most Y Combinator companies that come from India are essentially given this one option of opening an account with SVB for the reasons that I highlighted earlier. So we had between 60 to 100 Indian companies who had immediately lost access to their funds because they only repatriate into India ever so often. Now, also what SVB does is they create this relationship with you as a founder. What is their goal? Their goal is to go with you till IPO, right? Or like till you're huge, like a razor pay or something. Then they also ask you to bank with them as a founder. You have a big windfall, you have a big sale, you put your personal money in there as well. So a lot of Indians were suffering. It's sort of an emblematic of startup globalization today, mostly driven by Y Combinator, where a bank fails in California and employees aren't getting their payroll in India. So there was a very real impact. There was a risk to the Indian startup ecosystem, at least over the weekend. Now most of these guys have their money back. In terms of VCs, also very interesting because there's a little bit of mechanical thing to understand, like how do VCs actually fund their investments? There's GPs, there are LPs. You have to get money from LPs. Even if you don't want to get into all of that, essentially all these VCs have lines of credit with the bank. When they need money, they have to do a capital call with the bank. So VCs couldn't do that. Not to mention they put all their investment gains into the bank, etc. So the whole VC ecosystem was extremely at risk. And by the way, funding is not that hard to get right now, not that easy, to get right now anyway. So actually, a lot of people are worried about the ecosystem. And maybe, Suchita, you can comment on this. Like, if you have a systemic shock to like maybe, let's say, 20% of the VCs, what does it do to the remaining 80%? Like, are they pouncing and being predatory and trying to say, okay, let me get a deal the other guys couldn't get? Or does everybody become more cautious? I wasn't sure which way it would go, and I'm still not sure.
I think it'll always be a combination of the two, right? Like you'll always have, the little shark sort of circling companies or whatever else you could get at a cheaper rate. But if you look at any of these things, whether it's the lockdown or, COVID or any black swanny type events that have happened, irrespective of the scale, generally everyone sort of steers in the direction of caution. And I think right now, in any case, things are highly exacerbated because everyone is already so cautious. We haven't seen this kind of lull in startup activity in I don't even know how long. Like, Varun, if you remember all of our episodes last to last year in October, November, December, and even
funding,
unicorn.
Decacorn, some meta con, some other cons were coming up.
Yeah. And basically, I think right now, because the environment generally is fairly tepid, this definitely didn't add to the mix. So, Varun, I want to get your perspective on this. How do you and maybe I'm asking this because this is the first time I've seen it run on a bank. I haven't seen it before, and not even at this much proximity. Like Vidur, I'm sure you obviously saw it up and close during the Lehman Brothers crash and this, that, and the other. But Varun, you are a seasoned old man. What do you make of?
When the last thing happened, I had not quit my job and not even started my first startup. I started my first startup after the Lehman Brothers crash, a year after.
Oh shit! But what do you make of this? Because I was listening to a couple of podcasts, and I think the general consensus from everyone is this too shall pass, right? Like,
which is generally. I think everybody has to look at it that way because there's this whole point of too big to fail that always comes up. That's what everyone kept saying when Lehman Brothers happened. But I feel in this case, I think everyone's waiting to see what the Fed does because that ripple effect goes everywhere. But I think very quickly also saw the fact that I think the UK counterpart was getting. I think SoftBank was trying to buy off the UK counterpart.
I believe HSBC bought it for $1, which is the usual rate when you buy things that are bankrupt because you take on their liabilities.
So all the regions were getting bought up
for sale.
Yeah, so I think that the regions getting bought up was an interesting thing to see, and I feel people have kind of learned from. I mean, I'm not saying learned in terms of they will not do stupid things like what this was, but I feel there's been enough work spent saying how do you manage things when stuff like this happens. I guess the only problem
is... Can I comment on that real quick? So firstly, not enough people are commending the Fed, okay? Because this thing went down on Friday. And by Sunday, listen, it's their job. They have to do it. But the fact that it's a weekend doesn't help, right? And they essentially rescued the system. Because I'm telling you, on Monday, you would have seen bank runs at a lot of banks, a lot of small banks. They're called regional banks or community banks. Why would anyone keep above $250,000? Okay, so the first thing they did is they stopped that. But it's kind of like saying the Fed rescued COVID by printing money. Everything has a cost. So just
Yeah.
to get into the very basic mechanics of what they're saying, how they'll rescue it is they're saying, hey, you have these assets sitting there that are worth 80 or cents on the dollar, right? Instead of being worth 100, which they were when you bought them. You come to us, you give them to us as collateral, we'll give you loan against them as though they're worth 100. Now that's ridiculous. You're giving a loan to value that's more than like what the thing is worth. But I mean, it's the Fed and it's the US. You can print money and nothing happens, right? Like, it's the modern economic system that we live in. So the Fed is doing something that will have a cost, and this too is fine. This too shall pass, such, which is what you said. It does remind me of that meme with the dog sitting there in the fire and saying like, this is fine, because like I said, like, there's all these unrealized losses, right? Every other bank has this as well, and I have to say this was a very small mistake on the part of SVB. This is not like
Yeah.
Lehman, where you had toxic
Yeah.
assets. This is not like FTX, which was fraud, and this is not like many other situations that are like extremely bad risk management or like greed even. They bought government bonds paying 1.5%. It wasn't greed. It was growing too fast and not being able to handle it. Now with banking is a game of regulation. Okay, like even SVB kept their assets below 250 billion so that they wouldn't be regulated like a bank that is worth more than 250 billion. There's all these games you play. There is a little bit of greed, but they didn't do something too egregious, is my point, right? And now I do want to talk about the two other banks that also failed, which already points to a red flag of this being slightly
Yeah.
systemic, right? Again, this is fine, right? The dog meme. So one is Silvergate, which happened earlier in the week. Much smaller bank, still $5 billion in market cap or so, and they were more famous for serving crypto. Okay, and we'll talk about crypto in a moment. So with crypto being as down as it is, right, it's like a high beta version of startups being down. Like, obviously, it's just like dead, right? Crypto winter. So they completely could not handle it. Makes sense that they went down, but very similar situation, right? Deposits have gone down, but the assets are like worth less than they were on the books. Okay, so first Silvergate goes down, then SVB goes down, then even someone like me who's glued to Twitter, but too busy with the startup world. I have friends in YC, I'm talking to them. Completely didn't realize that this other bank called Signature Bank, $90 billion in assets, went down over the weekend as well. And the Fed announced it when they said, by the way, we're rescuing SVB. And oh, by the way, also we're rescuing Signature. So like the bank cascade had already started. Signature had the same problems as well. A $90 billion bank, something around the 35th or 50th largest bank in the US. It's not a joke. Like, these bank runs hadn't happened for 5 years or so. Not a single one, and this scale hadn't happened since 2008. So there is this. There should be a question. We should be thinking about it. As I mentioned with the Bear Stearns example, I did my first internship on Wall Street in 2008. Okay, at Goldman for the first time. The CEO of Goldman got $70 million in bonus. In 2008, and Lehman went down 2
Holy
months after.
shit.
So there can be that much of a discrepancy between where, like, even the experts think that we're at and where we're actually at.
So I have a question. Do you feel this also has happened, like you mentioned, because of the rate hikes happening the way they did? Because you said, right, within like what, a 1-2 year period, they've gone from like literally like no interest rates to like going the way they did, which generally is slightly more cyclical. You have at least like a longer period doing that. So is the Fed really kind of sorting out the problem they only created?
Very interesting. They're not, because technically it's on the bank to manage it, right? But nobody was used to managing these kind of moves, right? But it is still on the bank, and there are many investment banking solutions that exist, interest rate swaps and interest rate hedges to hedge this risk. But like, banks are run by humans, like if you do a good job, you do a good job, and if you don't, you don't. And the regulators that are supposed to oversee it may or may not catch it. What is the Fed doing going forward? This is a big macro thing, and it does have a huge impact on the global economy. Is they had actually said they're going to increase the rate 50 basis points more, still remaining. And there's a lot of chatter that after this happened, you surely can't be thinking about that, right? It would only increase the losses on these like banks' books and create a lot of risk in the system. So that actually might impact US monetary policy, which for all intents and purposes is global monetary policy. So another second order effect that is very, very big here.
So I want to come in with a quick question, and not to sound all like Enid Blyton about it, but what do you take away from this? Because it's kind of wild that SBF and obviously FTX in a larger context, SVB and anything that's happened in the past, all of them have kind of been put into the same bucket. But like you said earlier, the degree of manipulation in each of these cases is like, you know what I mean? Like it's incomparable. Like what happened at SVB, one could argue was overconfidence ki theek hai boss, 2-3 saal mein theek hi ho jayega. Versus, for example, FTX, which was straight up fraud. I'd love your thoughts on what do you do in scenarios like this where, all of these generally catastrophic events are thrown into the same bucket, assuming that, it was the same sequence of events that led to these outcomes, though actually in each of these cases, what led to, catastrophic outcomes, obviously we didn't see all the way to unfold in the case of SVB, is dramatically different. You know what I mean? Like what do you learn from this? Because so much of it is like,
Yeah.
is I don't want to say luck, but you know what I mean? Like so much
Put
of
your
it
money
is
in
like,
gold. I'm joking. I'm not saying.
Yeah, well, I
money in
mean,
gold.
I'm sure there's a
Great
lot of gold
financial
hawkers. No, there's a lot of people who are using this as an example to do this. And coming back to crypto, a lot of them are saying put your money in crypto because what did happen, this is not financial advice either, but what
Yes,
this does
Naval,
show
of
is,
all people, put
yeah,
your
I
money
know,
in
exactly.
crypto. That was fucking
He was
wild,
literally
man.
saying
That
that
was
treasurers
dumb.
of companies should consider putting money in Bitcoin and Ethereum. But his
Yeah.
point was that, listen, like this just showcases, this was what the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper was about. Banks are centralized. They're actually run by the Fed. We can't trust them. And also they run on a fractional reserve system. They don't have all your money when you want it, right? As opposed to say Bitcoin. So, that's something people can probably like look forward to over the course of the next 2-3 months where the crypto case will be made. And there is merit to that. This is why Bitcoin was created in 2008.
Yeah.
As for you saying all these incidents are correlated, it's what we just discussed. It's the rate shock. And the way they say rising tides lift all boats. What happens when the tide goes down, which is in the case like rates go up, it exposes the ugly underbelly of all the
Murkiness. Yeah.
boats that were
Yeah.
swimming quite high, right? And I think that's what's happening. Now, is the underbelly fraud? Is the underbelly bad risk management? Or is the underbelly something else? I think these incidents are not correlated in that sense, right? I do want to talk about one of the narratives that came about, maybe because of the fact that's happened FTX, is a lot of anti-tech or like tech envy, anti-startup, and
Yeah.
this part I understand a little bit more, anti-VC
Yeah.
sentiment on Twitter. Don't rescue them. What, screw
Let them die.
let them die, right? And now my
Yeah.
question is, like I said, these are real people, real employees, real startups, the innovation engine of, again, the biggest economy in the world, right?
Yeah.
If this was called the Farmer Bank of Kansas, which was an example floating around on Twitter, would
Yeah.
people have the same let them die attitude? My guess is not. So
Yeah,
there's also
yeah,
this
yeah.
like messaging problem that I think tech people have also realized. They're very disillusioned, like, oh my God, this is what people think of us. I thought I was like changing the world. Right.
Yeah.
So like, what do you think? Like, and does that exist in India, you guys think?
I think the tech bro energy has generally been something which I think has divided, although has divided Twitter, but Twitter is a tiny fraction of the overall piece. But I feel generally governments are looking at startups very differently now. I think in India it's I don't think it's as much because over here there's a lot more control in terms of how they
Yeah.
function. I feel as a system we
Regulation.
function very differently. In the
Yeah.
US, Silicon Valley operates like its own country, right? I think this is almost like a call out to that. Is that Silicon Valley seems to be operating on a different planet and a different country, and the rest of America seems to be in a separate part of it. And there's always been that differentiator there, but I don't think
But I
that
feel like-
exists as much in India.
Fox News already
Yeah.
said they went bankrupt because they went woke. So like,
Of course they did. Of course they did.
Gotta love Fox News. Gotta love Fox News. But we are
just
at
one last thing
Yes.
at the risk of extending it just very slightly. We talked about Indian startup ecosystem being affected. We only spoke about the YC element of it, but I do want to throw this to you to just ponder and your viewers and listeners as well. Like I said in the beginning, SVB was very, very heavily used because they were the most friendly to Indian startups. There is no
Yeah.
alternative, by the way, right? You have one bank that was basically
what are you
willing
saying,
to,
bro? HDFC, G's best, most efficient, easiest,
no,
best
but like,
app. Being
but how do you
sarcastic.
get in? I understand your sarcasm, but like name one American bank that even like as a joke would take you, right? And just to give you a sense of what the weekend was like for these guys, they're saying, okay, on Thursday, let's say you figure out your VC tells you get your money out, okay? What do you send the wire to? Who do you send the wire to? You don't have an account anywhere.
Yeah,
Right? These people are
yeah.
opening an account without you having social security numbers because you're registered in the US. And by the way, at the risk of speaking out of line here, like the Indian government might not be kosher with all the banking activity that's going on in the US with Silicon Valley Bank, they might look and be like, why is $2 billion that technically should be in India is lying there? So there is going to be a meaningful impact. This is far from over for startup guys. It's something to like actually for investors to help sort out as well, and we'll be seeing what happens.
I
If
think
the
this
past
also
3
kind
years
of,
weren't bad enough.
I think this also kind of is a signal, right? You're seeing a lot of startups, especially tech side, looking at other options apart from the US. In general, it takes far longer to get some of this stuff done. And if you look at the Middle East and how they're literally like welcoming everybody, come to Abu Dhabi, come to Dubai. Singapore's kind of also kind of figured it's seen out. I think we're at an interesting time when startups will take points like these and say, okay, once again, we can't put all our eggs in the American basket. And I think that might be an interesting turn of events from this.
Atmanirbhar
Definitely.
all the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
HDFC Bank.
Yes. And with that, thank you so much, Vidzi. Appreciate you popping in times of crisis, as always. First it was FTX and now it's SVB. Let's just
I
hope
appreciate
there are no more
becoming the black
crises.
swan.
But they will always be
The black-
RRR.
Yes, go RRR, Varun. I know you're a man of culture, unlike our friend over here.
Oh my God. Sure, of course. So much culture. Can't wait.
But anyway, thanks
But-
thanks for having me on, guys. It was super fun, and I just think this Black Swan correspondent is a title I can live with. Like, I like this.
Yes.
Love it.
Thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thanks,
See you,
guys. Have a
bro.
good episode.
Welcome back to Think Fast, where it's time for recommendations. It's a slightly longer episode today, but I think we've tapped into a lot of things, especially on the banking side. See, we both also know these terms. Okay, क्या सोचा था? नहीं जानते हम लोग जानते सब कुछ.
Of course. Just
Yes.
like we know
What's your
the lyrics
recommendation?
of Natu Natu.
What is
What
your
is my
recommendation?
recommendation? So, guys, by the time this episode airs, I would have officially turned 33 because my birthday is on the 15th of March, which is, and listeners, you guys are obviously recording 2 days before. But I obviously took a short break, and I've been taking breaks just to really reflect on like life and shit. And I have written this lovely post also on my Medium, which is suchitasalvan.medium.com. Called Bloom Where You Are Planted, and 33 more things I've learned at 33. So if you guys are in the mood for like a little chicken soup for the 33-year-old soul, please jaake padho and share the things that you've learned as you've aged. Not you, Varun, because you're too old.
I'm too old. But pre-birthday wishes to you. I shall send you a lovely box of my recommendations. Not something I normally recommend. I bought. Have you ever tried these Pebble Building Blocks? They're building blocks for adults. You can basically make those Pebble balancing pieces. It's so therapeutic. I just sit the entire day in any meeting, and I have those building blocks in front of me and just building shit out with it. It's like you have to balance these small stones on it. It's amazing. Just look it up, guys. Pebble
Like
Building
Maram
Blocks.
Pitti. No,
Yeah,
like
so
what is that? Pittu.
They're like, yeah, exactly. So
What was
pebbles,
that
these are
thing
building
called?
blocks. I don't know what it's called. But it's
Abhi,
much
what
fun.
was that game called that we played when you were small? Yeah, Pittu.
I have
Where
no
you
idea
have
what
to
it's
like
called.
build
I don't know what they call it in the Delhi, okay.
Okay. Down south we call it Natu Natu.
Natu. Everything is Natu. But by the way, you know what Natu means?
No.
Natu means like full like chapri, local, that kind. Like that's what it means. It's like Natu
Oh.
dance means like chapri dance. That's the literal meaning of what it is.
Suits you, Varun. Suits you.
Yes,
That's why it's
exactly.
your favorite song.
It's my vibe. It's my vibe. But that's it for this episode. By the time we come back for the next one, I will be in my hometown next
Oh my
week,
god.
and you shall be
Wow.
old.
Shit. A year older and wiser and richer.
Yes.
Let's keep that going.
Everything. Sab hoga. Kiravani will
Yes.
send you some of that Oscar gold. But that's it for the episode,
Can't
guys.
wait. Lovely.
Nothing from SVB is coming to you, but.
Thank God. Please, apne paas hi rakho SVB.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye guys. Bye.